In this video, I'll talk about advanced genetics and insights into advanced genetics, which are not going to be heard of or in a genetics book. So what I'm about to speak about is not in a book. It's not going to be in any genetics book. If it is, then I'm going to be surprised. Probably it isn't. And if it is, it's probably in some side lost place in genetics that nobody really looks at. There's a couple things that God did when he was making the human race. Now, the prior civilizations that lived in the human race as the human race, prior human civilizations, would have been different genetically. So I won't go into the differences between the society or the people, the humans that are alive now. The human race is genetically altered, very different from what it once was. If we were here long ago, thousands of years ago, we were not genetically like we are now. We've been manipulated and our genetics has been messed with and changed by God. So God did it. Today we're going to talk about chromosome number 1 and 2. We're going to talk about the importance of information sharing, the importance of also not sharing certain information, the importance of sharing in general or not sharing is a large part of how genetics behave, meaning humans' willingness to share it all will be a large behavioral concept to look at as to how our genetics work as a whole. To be not willing to share or willing to share, sharing information or withholding and not sharing information causes the genetics to behave a certain way and respond and react to itself and its environment in certain ways based upon information sharing or not. Okay, also, what's important is a coupling. So to be alive or to be born, you have to be coupled, and you have to couple with another a nuclear strand of DNA has to couple with a mitochondrial strand. They have to get together and do a coupling, and then they have to do what's called DNA sequencing. So the DNA sequencing is sharing. It's during fetal development where they're doing what's called protein synthesis. So first the two come together. They do what's called a coupling, and they become one. So it's like two strands of spaghetti that become one strand of spaghetti, but they're made from two. It's almost like a rope, but it's not a rope because a rope's made from 3 strands, and it's also going to be strongest, but this is only 2 strands. And it's one strand actually, though, or it can't be 2 strands. It has to become one strand, and it becomes the brain and the backbone and spinal cord of the human. So the right and left brain come together with the 2 strands. One has the right part of the brain, one has the left part of the brain. They spin around each other, and at the top they have 2 heads, and then they have a spinal cord made from 2 tails. And so that becomes an organism during fetal development. And so the 2 things that are required for the organism to survive at all, be able to come into fetal development, to even start it, is to couple. And then the information sharing process is done through what they call DNA sequencing. When they couple, they share line for line instruction for how to build the fetus. It's done through what's called protein synthesis by daughter cells, and which are just blind and fulfilling an instruction. So the cells that are doing the protein synthesis are not able to see what they're doing. They're just following blindly, and they're just following the directions. So it's interesting how they can do it. But each side or each strand will have half the instructions for the fetus to develop the fetus healthy. If the fetus is not healthy, it's because of some problem during the DNA sequencing, during the protein synthesis, during the fetal development. The fetus gets developed during a certain time. I don't know how long it is, over like 5 weeks or something of a 9-month pregnancy. The fetus is being developed. And if my information is slightly off on that, I don't know actually the exact time the fetus is being developed, but it's only in a short time the fetus is actually being developed, and then it just sits in the womb for 9 months while it grows. Each strand has half the instructions because God put made it. So first they have to couple. If they couple, they're allowed to do what's called protein synthesis. The coupling is checked by daughter cells, so which check the coupling. And if the coupling is done correctly, then they're allowed to start what's called protein synthesis and fetal development. And then they do protein synthesis is creation of flesh, bone, blood, brain, everything, skin, ligaments, joints, muscles, everything. And during the protein synthesis process, your eyeballs are being developed, your head and the spine and the brains are already there. They're already there from the start, but they're only developing starting with the spine and brain, and then the rest of all the organs come in and be developed. Now, each strand has exactly half the instructions on how to build that model of that fetus, which means that if they don't share the line for line instructions, if one stops sharing, it may be the other one keeps sharing, and ultimately you'll have what's called genetic disorders. Genetic disorders are anything going wrong with the process of maybe you're missing a leg or an arm during the development. If they don't share the information for whatever reason, the sharing does not go turn for turn, line for line. They each have half the instructions, which means that neither side can build anything but half the fetus. Each side has half the instructions to build half the fetus, so they share it together, and they have to share it line for line during the DNA sequencing, during protein synthesis, during fetal development. Fetal creation is a short time period of weeks or days or very short period of time where the fetus is actually being created. It's the most critical time because during the fetal development is when you have all the genetic disorders come in to play. Now, the genetic disorders are listed and kept in our chromosomes. So most nuclear DNA is just for storing information. There's mitochondrial DNA, which is functioning as mitochondria in the body, which are different, but the mitochondrial side of it does a lot of other things, like there's different functions for what the chromosomes are doing. Most of the nuclear chromosomes come from men that spread them down, and women can spread them too. But men don't spread mitochondrial chromosomes down to their children. Women spread both mitochondrial and nuclear, and the man will only share nuclear. He gets his mitochondrial from his mom, and then he'll be just using his mitochondrial, but he doesn't give it to his son or daughter. So a man does not pass down mitochondrial DNA. That's important to know. A woman does, and she'll pass down the nuclear from her dad and the mitochondrial from her mother to both kids, and the daughters will actually have the mitochondrial to share to both sexes, and the fathers will only shoot down the nuclear version because the fathers we don't share our mitochondrial DNA. We keep it, and then it gets used up throughout our lifetime. The chromosome number 2, I want to talk about the chromosome number 2 being, well, okay, so first we talked about the fetal development. The two things required for life itself would have been information sharing. The two having half the instructions each have to become one, and then shared line for line DNA sequence to develop the fetus, which means the fetus gets punished with a disease if they don't share line for line instructions. It's interesting to think that maybe, it's interesting to think that there might be a problem in the information sharing time period, but if there is a problem with the one they're not sharing, well, it happens often enough. There's a whole set of genetic disorders to have. Depending on how much they're not sharing, it may become what's called a rejected fetus, which is called a miscarriage. So if all miscarriages are not by accident, they're ultimately some kind of a stopping of the DNA sequencing during the protein synthesis of the fetal development. It gets stopped right in the middle of it, and ultimately, because it gets stopped, it's like having half a baby. It's not going to continue on. The body rejects the fetus whenever it thinks that it's not going to survive, if it thinks it's going to die. So otherwise, it develops into a healthy fetus. And if they're sharing line for line, and we'll assume that they might decide not to share, it's interesting to think that down to a chromosome level, there's interest in not sharing information, that human beings as a whole are information gatherers and not information sharers. They can also be information sharers and they can gather it, but people who hold secrets are doing a lot of damage, and some secrets need to be held. So just the secrets that need to be held, but ultimately the information to be shared needs to be shared. And so when we're not sharing certain information, it can screw everything up. And even the whole human race can be screwed up from a refusal to share information, because all of the genetics involved will freak out, meaning you can cause a disturbance in the entire body and ultimately during fetal development, the entire body's not even there until after. So most of the disturbance is created before the body even becomes there. Once the fetus is developed, it's kind of too late. Whatever information sharing they didn't do is going to be coming out as genetic disorders that are possible for the baby to get, or to have already, or to get later in life. But all genetic disorders will be gotten as a punishment, and they're all listed and put in the chromosomes as punishment for if they don't share information. So genetic disorders are all stored on how to make them. So when we get sick, we get a genetic disorder. It's from an instruction that is developed. Like all of sicknesses happen from instruction. Genetic disorders happen from specific instruction, which means that you can't create a genetic disorder unless you know how. And ultimately, the body gets instructions, explicit, exact instructions on what to do, why to do it, under what circumstances, to create some trigger mechanism which creates genetic disorder. And during the fetal development, it could be bad, it could be like fatal, it could be any degree to severe to mild, depending on what the information sharing, what they're doing with it, or refusing to share during DNA sequencing will cause problems. It's too late once the fetus is developed. But if the miscarriage, if the fetus is not rejected from the body because it's just a miscarriage, then it means that there was problems, but obviously it didn't become a miscarriage, or there was too many problems. So if the baby actually survives, the fetus gets developed into whatever it becomes. It's not missing any fingers or toes or arms or legs or organs or internal anything. Could be missing, not created. And so now so these are the requirements for life, meaning that information sharing and coupling, coming together two as one, are two things that you can't even exist unless you do. Now, we usually as humans spend the rest of our lives uncoupling and trying to uncouple. So it's like we got coupled, we had to couple to come to this world, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to uncouple and separate from each other. But ultimately, it's not about whether we're separate or we're coupled at this time, because the whole world's going to be coupled or separate, and many people are separate, many people are coupled, and they don't want to be separate, they're connected. But ultimately, whether they're separate or connected now, they couldn't be separate before. They couldn't be separate and come into this world, that's for sure. And ultimately, they would have to be coming together to even have a chance to come into this world and make it. And then if they separate after that, it's a mental separation, a spiritual separation. It's not a physical one, because the physical separation is required, or physical coming together is required. There can't be a separation because they won't develop. The fetus would not even, if they didn't come together and become one, it wouldn't become one fetus. It would become a blob of something rejected and miscarried. So chromosome number 2 has some caps on the telomeres. And those caps and telomeres were put on the chromosome number 2 to make an effect, which has to do with feelings and thoughts and instructions, and also receiving instructions and the giving of instructions, input, output. The chromosome number 2 was altered so that certain information would not get in it. So its chromosome number 2 has been hampered. On one side, it has, I think there's four telomeres on chromosome number 2, but most chromosomes have 2 telomeres because they have just 2 ends, one on each side. But chromosome number 2 will have often 4 ends, two ends on each side. It's like a 4. So the chromosome 2 is like a 4 in a sense because it's got 2 centromeres. So it's the only one that has 2 centromeres. Understand this genetics that maybe that what I'm telling you, it doesn't match the exact genetics. Maybe it seems I'm in error, but what I'm going to tell you is that I'm not here to debate and tell genetics, to claim whether it's right or wrong. I'm here just to tell you the information I have to share it with you. And so if some of the information I'm giving seems wrong, because you could check it, well, it's going to be probably right actually. But if it is wrong, then I wouldn't say that I'm wrong. I'd say, well, not that it's wrong. I'm not trying to say it's wrong. I'm just trying to share information. There's 2 centromeres on number 2. There's 1 centromere on number 1, and number 3 could have 1 or 2 centromeres. Ultimately, the centromeres are little brains on each strand of DNA or chromosome. And the telomeres are little doorways that open up to receive information and also to let information out. So each chromosome gets a specific instruction. The instruction goes in through the telomere, which opens a door and lets it in or not. So the telomeres could shut off and close and open. They close, they hold the instructions in, and the instructions go to the centromeres through the telomeres, into the centromeres, onto the individual chromosomes, which are taking individual instructions for whatever they're doing in the body, fulfilling out the roles of the body. Each chromosome takes a singular instruction and they're in pairs. So they're all going to be in what's called autosome pairs. Your body's not allowed to have singularity in it unless it's in a triune, kind of like you want to describe. If you're going to be a singularity, you have to be doing it through the Trinity, because the Trinity can be a singularity through 1 and 2 becoming a third as a first. And so if you take 1 and then the first half 1, and then you bring it in with the second half 2, then in the third spot you have both halves, and you consider it one whole, including 2 halves. The first half and the second half in the third place become one. There are 2 halves there. So in the third spot, there's 2 halves. You've got the first half in the first spot, the second half in the second spot, and then nothing in the third spot. So you just got 2 halves. There's 1 half in the first spot, the second half in the second spot. When the first spot moves into the second spot, then you've got both halves there. So you can have a singularity there, but it won't be accepted in the body. It has to move into the third, meaning that there's lots of genetic rules on what's acceptable, and the singularity is not acceptable in the body. It's also the most powerful. Singularity is the most powerful entity in our body. So we have a singularity, which is that the chromosomes try to not be paired. They try not to become autosomes. Understand that autosomes are paired DNA or paired chromosomes that are doing whatever they're doing. They're doing everything in the body that is from a chromosome level. Everything is happening. There's millions of things that are going on, constantly healing your body, regenerating it, doing or destroying it. Whatever they're doing something, and ultimately they are destroying as well as healing. So we also have what's called genetic programming, and our aging process is a program, which means we were programmed to age and shrivel up eventually. And so our aging process is not natural, and we get old and die from an instruction that is given to ourselves to age. Ultimately, we have no choice in it. It's what God did to us, and you could look at it as a punishment if you want, but ultimately it's not a punishment. It's a restriction of life. So life is not allowed to exist past 120 years. And whoever, God did it. And ultimately, he would say that I made it so humans die slowly by getting older, and they're deteriorating on a biochemical level through bioprogramming and biochemistry. Basically, you can instruct the biological organism to fulfill instructions by following in computer programming. So there's bioprogramming that goes on in our body. Our genetics are responding to orders by following sets of rules and following instructions. So they're used to following instructions. The DNA sequencing, the line for line, sharing the instructions line for line have to be exactly 50%, 50%, has to be exactly that they're sharing 100% with each other to develop the fetus correctly or even healthily. To have a healthy fetus, there must be a sharing of information that has a 100% chance of, and each side has only 50% of the information, which means if they don't share the information, then one side can't make both sides. It takes two sides to make one side. Two sides have to make one side. And one side gets created from two sides sharing information that only have half. They only have each half, which means that God did that. He made it so they only have half. Because he wanted them to share and give them an opportunity to share. He also probably told them if they don't cooperate, those two strands, they're going to be in trouble. The whole body will suffer and the fetus will get punished. Ultimately, if you can imagine God's telling the two chromosomes that when the fetus starts being developed and God says to them, to those little chromosomes, you better share information properly and cooperate with each other, you two, or you're going to punish your baby. And ultimately, it's true. Well, the baby will be punished for whatever they decide not to share. Because of the creation of the body, protein synthesis is actually creating the organs themselves, the brain, the bone. If they don't share information on how to do it, it won't be there. It just won't carry out the instructions, which means that you'll have missing toes, missing fingers, missing heads, or missing faces, missing anything. It could be internal organs, it could be skin, it could be. So you don't want to have not shared the right information. It's very important. So it's interesting that God had made it so so you have to share the information or else. Chromosome number 2, the capped ends on chromosome number 2 are to keep information from getting in there. And it's also what causes women to feel upset. So chromosome number 2, the way that it's been altered, makes women upset. And ultimately, the divine feminine suffers from it. It's ultimately, and what happened because God did it, he made it so the intuitive level of what women can do will be affected so that they are not able. So he made it so by what they did to our chromosome number 2, what happened to it is it got altered by God shutting it down on one side. So the feminine side of it would not be allowed to get the information in there. But the 2 centromeres on chromosome number 2, one of them's for the masculine and one's for the feminine. This is all going to be information that if you were a geneticist, you'd probably say he's full of it. He doesn't even know what he's talking about. I mean, we've never read anything about this. Well, I know. You probably have no idea. But the reality is that my information is correct. It doesn't matter if I know what I'm talking about. I don't need to know what I'm talking about. I can just tell you what I'm told to share. Yeah, and it's not funny. It's ultimately very serious. It's very serious. The way that the telomeres were capped on chromosome number 2, it caused the feminine to be less intuitive and ultimately more frustrated. And so women have feelings that are more frustrating than men. And women will deal with emotions that men don't have to deal with. And so the side that men get the centromere on chromosome number 2 is masculine. And there's 2 centromeres there, one's feminine, but the one side of chromosome number 2 that receives instructions will go to the second centromere, which is the feminine side, and nothing goes in there to the second, which means the second centromere on chromosome number 2 has to get instructions from the first centromere on the exact same chromosome to know what the instructions are, which means that the masculine centromere on chromosome number 2 has to pass information into the other centromere, the second centromere on chromosome number 2, and it's supposed to be coming through the telomeres ends directly to the second chromosome centromere. But the way that it works now is that the chromosome number 2, the centromere, second centromere, hers is getting the instructions through the first centromere from the first centromere is getting instructions through the one side of the telomeres, which are not capped, which means that it's putting the masculine. God set it up so the masculine has an advantage over the feminine, both in feelings and willful instruction and absolute willful ability to keep power and will. meaning the man can keep a mental power over the woman, and he's less frustrated. He's going to be more in charge, and the man will be naturally more able to hold his own and actually have the feeling that he knows when she doesn't know. And ultimately, it's because of our genetics that were altered. That's as hard as this is to believe, and I'm sure if you know about genetics, you would say that what I'm saying is like, well, not absurd, but if it's true, you would say like it's pretty remarkable because what he's saying is like not in genetics. No, genetics never told us any of this, which means that people don't know that there's two forms of bacteria. One of them's feminine, one's masculine. Like in science, there's two kinds of bacteria, and they don't say that one's feminine and one's masculine. But to say that there's two kinds of bacteria, well, there is two kinds. Well, I know, but they're both single-celled organisms. And the two kinds of bacteria are one's feminine, one's masculine, and they can also switch. And so understand that if they switch so that one becomes feminine that used to be masculine, or one that's feminine becomes masculine, then we wouldn't know when the bacteria is becoming feminine or masculine when it's an organism which is asexual. So it's not using the other to have sex and have to reproduce. It's reproducing from its own. It's mommy and daddy as one, which means that bacteria or single-celled organisms don't need another parent. So they can, like, dad can have babies and his kids come out, whether they're girls or boys, they're all dad. So I'm not gonna say they're all boys. If they're girls, they're all dad, which meant that whether they're feminine or masculine, it's not seen as you'd have to have a astute understanding that it's hard to differentiate what is what. It's why the gender, the third gender, or the mixing of two sexes causes confusion, because it's, what is it? Is it masculine or feminine? Well, it could be both, and it could be neither as either. So I'm gonna say that again. It could be both, but it could be neither as either. So when you say it like that, it's like, wow, like, but that's hard to make sense. Like, neither as either. Yeah, neither as either, and either together, neither nor, or both. And it's the same thing. So it's both. Yeah, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Well, I know it doesn't. It's what causes confusion when it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It means if you can't identify what it is, or it's a mixture of both, which makes it either one and then neither one. I mean, is it neither one or either one? Well, it'll be either one or neither one, depending on when you look at it. And then that's when it is, whatever it is. So if it's neither one, and then it turns to either one, and then it's one or the other, then you'll have to say it was always that, right? Well, maybe it wasn't always that. Maybe it's just been that way since you looked at it. 10 minutes before it was something else. But you wouldn't know what it changed into or changed from, out of. You would only assume whatever you're looking at is what it is when you identify it. So when you identify bacteria, it could change. Its singularity doesn't change, but its sexual orientation could change, and it really doesn't make a difference, because if you're singularity, whether you're feminine or masculine, singularity is a singularity. So you could say there's a masculine singularity, which is not feminine, but you could also say there's a feminine singularity, which is not masculine, but singularity is a singularity. So if there's a feminine singularity, it's just the same thing as a masculine singularity. In fact, if it's a singularity, there's no difference between them. The singularity is a singularity. So understand that then we'd have to say that feminine can't be singularity; it has to be plural. And if we say that it's plural, it has to be feminine. Well, then what if it's masculine and it's plural? Well, then wait a minute. What about, isn't masculine singularity? Well, usually it is, but what if it's masculine and it's a plurality? Well, then what if I say that it can't be a plurality if it's masculine? It's always singularity. Well, then we'll have an argument in behavioral genetics. We'll say, like, one professor might say that there's no such thing as plurality in men. There's only such thing as plurality as women. And then women are plural, men are singular. And ultimately, if a woman's singular, she's singular through being plural, as the prime number 2 in mathematics becomes able to be prime. And ultimately, a prime 2 in mathematics says that it can be a singularity. It's like a marriage between two people, a husband and a wife, causes singularity. The marriage is the singularity. It's made of two things. The singularity that a marriage is made of two things. It's made from the husband and the wife. It becomes a marriage. Now it's one thing. And a marriage is not two things. It's one thing. It's both husband and wife together as one in spirit. And in that one place that it is now, it's not, it's no longer a singularity. It's a plurality as two now, but it becomes one. So it's a singularity now instead, actually not. So when it becomes a plurality, it becomes actually, in a marriage, at the moment it becomes a plurality, it becomes a singularity and not a plurality. And it's actually a plurality now and a singularity, which means that when you see two coming together, it's confusing and it doesn't make sense, because you'll say, wait a minute, there's two of them there, right? Yeah, okay, now if they get married, there's one of them there. There's one marriage, they're not having two marriages. A husband and wife doesn't have two marriages. A husband and wife has one marriage. It's one marriage between two people. So then what is the marriage? Is it the marriage singularity? Well, it is, yes, or it's not married, because there's no such thing as a marriage that's plural, and it's not even made of plurality. Well, it is made of plurality, but it's going to become a singularity if it actually works. It becomes one marriage, not two. If it stays two, it'll be like it never got married. If there's two marriages there, it means it never got married. Because if you have a husband and wife and they get married twice, well, they didn't get married at all. If they get married once, it is one time, one marriage. And now it's singularity that is just became plural for a second, why it became singularity afterwards. So the plurality that becomes singular is in the marriage of two things. And so ultimately singularity that's from two things in the marriage is the same singularity as a half that's not got the other half. So if you want to look at the difference between singularity that is considered to be the first half, it doesn't have the second half. The first half is a singularity and it doesn't have the second half. The second half is the second part of the singular. It's also singularity because they can't be plural. First half, second half don't get together. They can't be plural. And when they do get together, they're still not plural yet because they could be together. And ultimately, that's how chromosomes, which are called autosomes, are. They're like a boyfriend, girlfriend. They're ultimately together, paired, but they're separate, which means that they're not married, but they're boyfriend and girlfriend maybe. And so the autosomes in our body have to be in pairs. They can't be singularities. Your chromosomes aren't allowed to run around your body by themselves. And if they are, they're what's called mitochondria. And ultimately, mitochondria are singularity that are in your body, but they're coming in the third place from a Gemini position. That's a first as a third from first half and second half, getting into the third house. And then you have two halves in the third house. It becomes the two halves could become one. And in the third place, you have the first singularity that comes from a plurality. It's always going to happen in the third position. So if it's a singularity from the first position, it's the same. It's only half. If it's a singularity from the second position, it's also only half. If it's a singularity in the third position, well, it's likely made from two halves, which makes it okay. But there's also a possibility that in the third position, it still doesn't have both halves, because it didn't want one half. If it rejects one half, which means that all the positions are all capable of being singularity and not plurality. So singularity happens first. It's ultimately singularity is a mistake as a half. The singularity is not correct. And so we try to fix it. We try to get it fixed in the third. It could also be fixed in the second. But if it gets fixed in the second, it may not be allowed to be singularity in the second, because it may have to get to the third, because the Trinity is three, which means that it's like saying you have the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. You can't say that like you could have the Father and the Son in the second position, because that leaves the third position where the Holy Spirit is out. So if you're going to have the Father in the first position, the Son in the second position, and the Holy Spirit is the Father and the Son in the third position, as the Holy Spirit can be both the Father and the Son, is the Holy Spirit in the third position. It's now one, the Holy Spirit in the third position, that has both the Father and the Son. And because it's in the third, it becomes a first with all three as one. And it's actually one, not all three. So it becomes confusing again. It makes it so it doesn't make sense, meaning that what you'll do is when you look at the truth, it won't make sense. So understand that if everything makes sense, you're not really seeing it correctly. That's what I'll tell you. Because what I'm saying is, what you have to expect to be aware of is that if what you're looking at makes perfect sense, well, it might be true. But I'm saying when you're looking at the truth, you're going to see a lot that doesn't make sense, and you won't even see how it could make sense. And now if you're looking at that, I'm going to say, keep looking. Look at the stuff that doesn't make sense. And it will make sense when you look at it long enough. But understand, most people won't look at what doesn't make sense. They'll only look at it and say it doesn't make sense. So then I've already seen it and it doesn't make sense. So now I'm going to look at something that does make sense. I want you to look at everything that doesn't make sense. Go back to everything that you think doesn't make sense and relook at it. You've overlooked a lot, is what I'll tell you. And you've missed a lot because you just stopped wherever you're confused, but you didn't say you were confused. You would say it is obvious that it's not going to be confusing if it makes sense. So you just kind of, wherever you can't find something, an answer somewhere quickly, you'll get confused, or it'll cause confusion, and your understanding won't think it's confused. It'll think what's seeing is obvious, that there's no confusing about it, is that whatever it is not possible, or it's not there, or it's yeah. They'll say whatever. It's not a matter of I can't understand something. It's a matter of what I'm confused about. It's like, if I understand it, I'm not confused about it. So people have an idea that when they're looking at something and it confuses them, they have an idea that they don't want to remain confused still. So they try to find an answer to why it doesn't confuse them. They'll say, well, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they don't care. Whatever it is they tell themselves as to why they're not going to be confused about something that will continue to confuse them if they continue to try to look at it and understand it, but they don't. So ultimately, you'll remain confused. And so you have to tell yourself that I don't need to look at that, or I don't want to look at that, or I'm not interested in that, or what it is. Because ultimately, that's how you fix it, is by refusing to kind of look at it. You'll have to see it as something you didn't understand yet otherwise. And it'll cause feelings which you don't like. So this is designed to tell for the women, for feminine here, your feelings will be getting messages from the masculine, which is also kind of feels unfair, because understand that although men run this world, well, it's because it's a man's world. And truly, what I'll tell you is, if I could tell you the truth and understand, like, if I'm not worried about the world seeing this video, or whoever's going to see it is supposed to see it, but whoever's not supposed to see it is not supposed to see it, because I wouldn't want to tell everybody maybe truths that were disappointing, that would disappoint us all. But ultimately, if something is confusing, it's always the truth that a person will not want to see the truth then, because they won't want to remain confused and try to keep looking at something they can't understand. So ultimately, us humans are quick to refuse to learn, and we're really quick to want to not look at something twice, because we already know it's not worth it. And ultimately, we'll also not want to know. So humans will not want to know on purpose, because they're afraid to know, and they might get a feeling that they want to know something, or they need to know it, and they won't want to know it then, because they're going to know that if they know, it's not going to be good. So they'll say, I don't want to know. Don't tell me. Do not tell me. And that's how they'll deal with it. So ultimately, most humans are in a conundrum, a mental conundrum, where it causes our feelings to be very upset and disturbed for no reason, because we're in some disposition. I want to talk about for a minute disposition. Disposition is when you're out of the position that you should be in, and when you're displaced, you're in what's called disposition. You're not in the position you should be in. And so if you're in a position and you should be in it, you're in position, and we should all be in position and in the position we're supposed to be. And if we're displaced or in a disposition, it's because we are not in the place we're supposed to be. We're actually out of it, and looking at it, it causes the disposition, the focusing on the position we're supposed to be in, but we're not in. And it's always has everything to do with a disagreement. So if the two sides are in disagreement, it will not be a good thing, meaning you can't disagree with your enemy. You certainly need to be in agreement with your enemy. You can be in agreement with anything you want about your enemy. But the idea is, if the wars and the struggles and the conflicts that we have a lot to do with genetics and our behavior, and how it is made to restrict us, so that we will struggle and have emotional issues and ultimately frustration and problems. And especially women are getting instructions from men, and ultimately they'll take orders from men, and that's how it works. And it's built on a molecular level and the chromosomal level. The whole thing, the whole genome is built so that men are in charge, and men will receive the instructions first. And men will think quicker. They'll have the charge. They'll be in the spiritual position over the women, and they'll be first and foremost, whereas the women will be second and thirdly, fourth even, but not as a first. And if it's as a first, it's in a struggle and in a disposition and probably conflict. So the truth is that the human race is in a conflict, in a struggle, in the position it's in, because it's actually in a bad position, as our genetics are all screwed up, meaning God screwed our genetics up, if you want to look at it truthfully. What he would say is, yes, I restricted your genetics so that you could not be superhuman anymore. So if your spirit is immortal, your body's not immortal. And so if your spirit is immortal and it can't be killed, your body can be killed and will be killed, and it's being killed. It's being killed slowly on a time basis. So you're under a death sentence. When you were born, you were under a death sentence, which meant that your being alive and born was a guaranteed death. If you didn't ever become alive, you wouldn't need to be dying. You wouldn't die. You only die because you became alive. So becoming alive is the reason why you die or have to. And ultimately, if you don't die, well, that would be nice. If you're going to be taken up in the sky like Enoch by the Zeta, well, then, that would be pretty cool. But, I'm doubting that's actually going to happen. And ultimately it could. The Bible talks about Enoch being, God picked him up, he never died, meaning very few people, and maybe they don't actually have to die. But I'd say that don't say 99.9% of us. It's more than that. Meaning 100% of us have to die. And if there's any exceptions, it's still 100%. So it would be so many few and far in between would actually make it out alive. Escaping life alive is about impossible. And people would think that it's ridiculous to even think that it could be done. But understand, our whole aging process is slow or fast. Some people will age fast. Some people will age slow. Some people will be going downhill quick when they get in their 40s or 50s. And some people last in their 70s or 80s and they're doing pretty good, which means that it's all about our genetics and what's working for us. To be in agreement it can't really be faked. If it can be faked, well, it can't. Of course, it could be faked. But understand, to be in agreement, to fake being in agreement is not going to work, because it ultimately puts a disposition in the feelings, in the spirit, a disposition, even if two sides are pretending to get along in agreement. Well, if they're not getting along, there's a struggle in the spirit that's not happening physically in the visible world, which means that there's a lot of feelings you'll be struggling with, but you'll wonder why you're struggling with your feelings. But if there's nothing going on, well, understand, if you're having feelings and struggling with your feelings, there is something going on. It's some struggle happening, which means that if you're having a struggle, it's something happening. And if you say, I don't know, I'm just mental because I have these struggles and I don't know what it is, well, then understand it's something. And if you don't know what it is, doesn't mean it's not there. It doesn't mean it's not happening. And it's not normal for you just to have mental aberrations or